John Shipton is the father of Julian Assange, probably the world's most famous prisoner of conscience. John has crossed the globe, travelling to numerous countries to lobby governments and civic bodies demanding freedom for his son. Julian Assange is currently being held on remand in a British maximum security prison. He has been locked up in the notorious Belmarsh prison for nearly 4 years, awaiting the outcome of a tortuous extradition process to the United States. In the United States, he faces charges of spying and violation of national security laws for his publishing work at WikiLeaks. If he is convicted, the 51-year-old Australian national will be incarcerated for the rest of his life in a US prison. 12 years ago, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published thousands of secret US documents that exposed the criminality of American, British, and NATO wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. John Shipton, welcome and thank you for your presence.
Thanks, Finian. Pleasure to be here with you.
Can I begin by asking you, last week, prominent American and European media outlets, including the New York Times and The Guardian, published a joint statement calling for the release of Julian Assange. They stated that he should be freed because, quote, publishing is not a crime. So, John Shipton, are you heartened by this renewed appeal to the Biden administration?
Yes, indeed. Also, I might add that the Nikkei, Japanese publication, which actually owns the Financial Times of London, made a similar statement that supporting the previous statement you mentioned, and also supporting Prime Minister Anthony Albanese of Australia's determination that the matter be brought to a closure.
Right. John, when was the last time you were able to contact Julian, your son, in person? And what are the conditions like for him?
Well, it's a maximum security prison. He's held in circumstances where he can't speak for himself, so we must speak for him. Incommunicado, really. Often he has to spend 23 hours a day in his cell. And the circumstances are that Julian, I think now, is the longest serving remand prisoner in his wing. I remind everybody that this is going on for the 4th year that Julian's been held on remand as an innocent man. And then in total, 13 years of arbitrary detention attested to by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in February 2018, a very strong statement from the United Nations insisting that Julian be freed and that the United Kingdom and Sweden pay Julian compensation.
Yeah. The prison deprivation imposed on Julian has been condemned as torture by the United Nations Special Rapporteur and international doctors. What kind of personal character reserves have sustained Julian until now?
Well, I don't know. He seems to be adaptable at the same time, continue to his fight for his freedom and continue to resist. But I don't know. It's just from the outside, it's extraordinary looking at Julian from the outside, 13 and a half years now. It's an extraordinary testament to human courage and resilience.
Yes, indeed. It is 12 years, John, since WikiLeaks exposed the notorious US war logs about its military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in many ways, those shocking disclosures were world-changing in terms of increasing public understanding about the criminality of American-led imperialist wars. Do you think Julian remains proud of his revelations? Or may I ask, do you think he regrets what he did, given the enormous cost in terms of his own personal suffering?
Oh, I can't answer that because I would be speculating on what another man thinks and feels in his circumstances. It's just not possible for me to do such an exchange of being. However, I can say that if it were me, adding regret to 13 years of persecution would be utterly sadistic and drive me mad, if it were me. But as for Julian, I cannot say.
Yes. John, Christmas must be an incredibly more anguished time for you and your family. Now, I'm not presuming your religious convictions, but for Christians around the world, Christmas is a time of hope in the midst of adversity. And can I ask you, do you still feel hopeful about Julian's plight?
Oh, the hope. Pandora's vase let out hope. And, hope makes very fine breakfast and a poor dinner. I don't, for myself, do hope. I just take each step as it comes towards me in the flow of life and do what I can with it. Sometimes I have human frailty and let things procrastinate. As most of the time, I find myself able to attend to what comes before me. So that is how I approach it. The circumstances of support for Julian are now a rising tide worldwide. Every single European Parliament has an Assange supporter within it. And in some cases, like the Greek Parliament, of 300 parliamentarians, 90 are in the Assange support group. In the Australian context, we characterised the last election wherein the Labor Party was elected as an Assange election because the successful candidates all had the freedom of Julian Assange as a part of their platform, in some cases, a substantial part of their platform. So that's changed the constitution of the Australian Parliament to where the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has now, for the third time, publicly stated that this matter must be brought to a close, that it's gone on for far too long and the circumstances are questionable.
That perhaps reflects on why these newspapers have begun publishing this joint statement, the New York Times, the Guardian. Maybe they're reflecting this rising tide of public support for Julian around the world.
Well, yes, that's an interesting combination. They perceive this incoming support, this rising tide of support for Julian worldwide, and they also perceive a declining tide of support for themselves. So being aware of their own safety, they join in the support for Julian. And it's about time, actually. They've been a bit sort of slow on the matter. Well, more than a bit slow.
Yes, well, indeed, John. I mean, when the WikiLeaks published those secret documents 12 years ago, papers like The Guardian and the New York Times made great newsprint out of that information. I mean, they benefited greatly from those explosive stories and reporting. So they're very much obliged to support Julian, given the great role that he's served in public interest.
Yeah, I reckon so. But they, of course, had benefit, and their benefit, because their news organisations is always fleeting. However, worldwide benefit from every person who takes the troubles to, actually, from every person, even though you don't take the trouble to read the cables or the Iraq war logs or the Afghan war files, you still benefit by the understanding of how policy is enacted by the United States and its allies that brings you benefits in the, for example, withdrawal of all of the troops, the Allied troops, the United States and Australia, unfortunately, removing their troops from Iraq because the Iraqis refused, point blank, refused to ratify the Status of Forces Agreement because they understood from reading the cables the circumstances that the United States occupation of their country were undergoing. They understood it from reading the cables. Really important. Another one, the Chagos Islanders were all packed up and dumped in Mauritius for the purposes of the United Kingdom to give an Air Force base to the United States called Diego Garcia. On the cables, their lawyers, based on the cables, were able to bring a case to the International Court of Justice and prevail. They prevailed over the United Kingdom's, dear, oh dear, shocking removal of the entirety, a genocide, a cultural genocide, of the entirety of the population of the Chagos Islands and dumping them in Mauritius. Immense benefits to everybody worldwide.
Indeed, John. I mean, it's perverse and despicable, in my opinion, that Julian is being persecuted for the great good that he's brought along with his colleagues at WikiLeaks. I mean, can you get any personal communication with Julian? Is there any way to contact him, like coming up to Christmas? Is there any concessions to communicate with him, to convey messages, personal greetings, or messages of love and support? Is that?
Oh, yes, there's a website called writejulian.com, and people send Julian letters there. For myself, Julian is allowed, when he has the credit, he has to get financial credit in advance. Julian is allowed a 10-minute phone call, international phone call. So I get a 10-minute call. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's guillotined after 10 minutes. It can be quite comic because you can start an idea and get halfway through it, and then it's guillotined, and you're left standing with an idea half formed, which he will maybe take the wrong view of.
John, sorry for the wicked humor, but some things don't change, like calling your dad looking for money. Like
yeah.
That's a terrible black humor. But yeah, and how frequent were these calls? How often would you get a call like that?
Well, it depends upon the circumstances and the demand in the jail for calls. So he has to pick an avenue. There's 800 prisoners. Every call is monitored. And I imagine in particular Julian's calls would be of concern to the authorities.
I mean, we have to say, John, I mean, it's just outrageous that for what he's charged with, whether and those are very dubious charges, but just taking those charges at face value, I mean, to be put into such, draconian conditions of a high security prison that's usually used for the most dangerous terrorists. I mean, it is quite outrageous. almost absurd, that this is being allowed to happen in a European country.
It's depraved and black. And those bureaucrats, those little Eichmanns that sign off on memos to remove Julian or remove a privilege or cause Julian to be incommunicado in a maximum security prison. I mean, it's nauseating and depraved. And it is a sad reflection upon the currency of the administration of law in the United Kingdom. In my view, the United Kingdom and its the Colonial Foreign Office and the Crown Prosecuting Service deliberately set upon this course to keep Julian in circumstances where he couldn't have a platform, and secondly, to keep Julian in the most restrictive circumstances so that he had found difficulty in defending himself, and also structure the series of court cases so that they would enable the United Kingdom to fulfill the demands of the United States for extradition of Julian Assange. That's my view, that they are conscious and deliberative in this persecution.
Yes. John, finally, I'm just going to ask you this final question. This is a hypothetical scenario, of course, but what would you say to US President Joe Biden if you were face to face? President Biden could release Julian using his White House executive powers. And Mr. Biden, we should remember, lost a son related to US military conduct. And God forbid, but you might lose your son. What would you say to Joe Biden as one father to another?
Well, I would, hesitatingly, but I'd still go through with it and remind Joe Biden that, the circumstances of losing a son and having another son run off the rails must be heartrending for him, and he would understand that the persecution of Julian Assange over a period of 13 years causes the same level of distress to Julian's father and Julian's family, and we maybe would be able to have a meeting point there. In other terms, it brings no credit to the United States, the United Kingdom, or Sweden to allow this farce to continue. Brings him no credit and brings him no benefits whatsoever. If they're cynical enough to say, well, we wanted to oppress and intimidate publishers and journalists, I would reply to that and say, well, okay, you've done it. It's over. You've achieved that aim. All of the newspapers, the mass media, legacy mass media in the world have gone soft on everything. They follow government lines, so you've achieved that. So there's no further profit in keeping Julian Assange in jail. It's time for him to come home to his kids.
John Shipton, many thanks for sharing your grief and your hopes with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Finian. It's very kind of you.
Happy Christmas, John.
And Merry Christmas to you. Godspeed.
Thanks, John.